Alberta's premier has put a pause on green energy projects, and the left and the mainstream media, but I repeat myself, are losing their minds. I'm Sheila Gunn Reid, and you're watching The Gun Show.
Today, the federal government released the draft clean electricity regulations. We will be doing detailed analysis in the months ahead. However, one thing is clear. The draft regulations are unconstitutional, irresponsible, unrealistic, and would make life less affordable for Albertans and Canadians. They will not be implemented in our province, period. They can't. We are beginning our talks with the federal government, and if we can't get alignment, Alberta will chart its own path to ensure we have reliable and affordable electricity for the people we serve. This means making sure we have adequate natural gas baseload and incentivizing CCUS-abated natural gas generation, small modular reactors, hydrogen, and a sustainable amount of wind, solar, and other renewables to drive down electricity costs. Albertans and our government care about responsible environmental stewardship. We are confident Alberta's plan will get us to a reliable and affordable carbon-neutral power grid by 2050. This is the direction Alberta is going. We invite the federal government to support us.
Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith continues to impress me with her boldness and her ability to ignore the screaming and the crying and the gnashing of the teeth that continues to come from the left and the mainstream media when she does something that they don't like, which are things that are generally in the interest of everyday Albertans. In this case, she has put a pause on green energy projects until a thorough examination is done of the Alberta electrical grid and the end of life of these green energy projects, because in oil and gas, you need to have a plan and a budget for the end of life of your project, but not so in green energy. They can just let these things run their course and then move on to the next thing. And it leaves Alberta taxpayers and Alberta landowners holding the bag. And then, the impact on the grid. If you have a strong reliance on green energy and then the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine, and there's no fossil fuel backup, what does that mean for Alberta? Rolling blackouts, brownouts? We saw in Texas a few years ago what happened when there was too much green energy on the grid in an oil-rich place. Sound familiar? And a catastrophic weather event. In that case, a snowstorm hit the state. The power was out for days and people died. And so how do we stop that from happening here in Alberta? Our premier is trying to find out before she allows any more green energy projects to go forward. Great. Seems reasonable to normal people and not so the left. So joining me now to discuss this and several other things, including the Hawaiian wildfires, electric battery storage farms and the implications of what happens there if those things set on fire, and a few other things, is my friend Michelle Sterling from Friends of Science. Take a listen. This free episode of The Gun Show is brought to you by
Adam So's here for Rebel News. Our company is growing quickly, and we'd actually like for your company to grow too. That's why this ad space that I'm speaking through right now is actually available for you to purchase. So instead of people listening to me, they could actually be learning about your company, learning about your business. If this interests you, if this is an opportunity you'd like to capitalize on, send us an email at ads@rebelnews.com.
So joining me now to talk about the overheated rhetoric around Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith pausing renewables for a very short time, by the way, is my friend Michelle Sterling from Friends of Science. And Michelle does a really great job of cutting through the nonsense and the hyperbole and going straight to the facts. And One of the things Michelle really does is tell us all to chill out when the media tells us to panic. Michelle, what can you tell us about Premier Smith's pause on renewables? Because if you listen to the left and the media, but I'm probably repeating myself there, the sky's falling and millions and gajillions of people are going to be unemployed.
Well, it may be that some people will be unemployed, but I think it's probably better than Alberta going to blackout. And that risk was very clearly laid out in the Alberta Electric System Operators 2022 Market Statistics Report, which came out in March of 2023. And in it, they noted that last fall, we had 7 grid level 3 alerts. And that means that blackouts are imminent or that they're going to have to load shed from, say, a large industrial user. So those 7 blackouts, in every case, the collapse of wind was a key factor. And 4 of those happened in December when it was really, really cold. There was extreme cold all across the province. So a very high risk situation. In fact, December 20th was one of them. So just imagine just before Christmas, you go to blackout and all the food in your fridge gets, unfrozen and everything else. And again, people always think of a blackout as being, maybe 1 or 2 hours till they get things back up. Well, it can be worse than that. Also, people should recognize when the system has to shed some load and go to one of the big industrial users and ask them to please be disconnected from the grid, they're paid for that curtailment. They're paid many thousands of dollars for that. So on the upside, it does save us from going to blackout, but we still have to pay for it. Now, in the interim, I note that about 1,000 megawatts we were short about 1,000 megawatts of dispatchable power last year. So dispatchable power is like natural gas. It's the kind of power that you can turn up or down at will, whereas wind and solar are entirely dependent on whether the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. So that's not dispatchable power. Anyway, we were short about 1,000 megawatts last year, and that's probably another factor in the near blackouts. Now, I've seen online that we've since added almost 1,000 megawatts, so that will bring us back into shape. But if we're planning to add more renewables, then once again, the system will be unstable. So I think the Premier did a good thing.
Now, there's something I learned from that, in that I had no idea that these green energy projects are going ahead without a plan for the end of life of the project. For me, I was sort of blindsided by this because in oil and gas, particularly in the oil sands, there has to be a plan in place for the end of life of the project with regard to reclamation and then managing the site going forward. And that's all in the approvals process of the project, as in a shovel cannot go into the ground unless there's a plan for this thing when construction is done and when the useful life of the project is over. There's none of that apparently happening in the green energy industry. So when you see the outrage from the environmentalist left, all we're asking them to do is do what we're expecting the oil industry to do, and that the oil industry has already done for decades.
That's right. And when you look at the reclamation in the oil industry, if you look at the oil sands, really we're cleaning up Mother Nature's spill. And you look at the wetlands that have been recreated, they're beautiful, thriving wetlands. And the reason why there's like a 40-year certification process is so that people can't just drive up with some sod, lay some sod and plug in a few trees and say, we're done. It's got to be a thriving ecosystem that will survive on its own and be very similar to what was there at the beginning. With wind and solar, the problem is that, many of the aspects of these constructions are quite toxic. Solar panels leach cadmium and lead, so you do not want them to be on prime agricultural land. Maybe out in the special areas, where there's very limited opportunity for agriculture there. That might be a good area. It's also a very sunny area, but you don't want it on prime agricultural land. And, maybe it won't leach today, but as it gets damaged over time, that's when the layers start to disintegrate. And cadmium, there's an interesting story about Japan where they had some cadmium leach into agricultural soil, and it caused people to have itai, which translates to ouch, ouch, but it's actually an internal disastrous poisoning of the body that cannot really be remediated. So you don't want that on agricultural land. The other thing with wind turbines, there's a tremendous amount of concrete used in them. And we have one example from TransAlta. It's from quite a few years ago, the Taylor Wind Farm. It was only up for 7 years. Then when they took it down, they reclaimed the concrete, 60 tons of concrete from one wind farm. And the way that they reclaimed it is they sort of scattered it alongside one of their hydro facilities as soil erosion control. So it didn't go in the landfill, so that's good. But, how many places can we scatter 60 tons of concrete and call it reclamation? Now, I understand there are ways to reclaim concrete, like you can grind it up and use it for aggregate or something. Some people have noted that on our Twitter feed. Great, but then let's have that written up in the approvals. Now, the other thing people should be aware of, I mentioned that we now have another 1,000 megawatts on the grid. There are 23,000 megawatts of projects in the pipeline. So, to keep the grid balanced, you have to have equivalent conventional power to go with the renewable power. That would mean we would have to build an additional 23,000 megawatts of conventional power. And a further issue is that, a couple of the upcoming coal to gas conversions and small gas plants, because of the way that the clean electricity standard is structured and stated, it's not clear if they would be approved. So, you have people who are already spending a lot of time and money to switch over to gas, only to now be told, well, hey, wait, maybe not, or maybe you'll be penalized, or maybe now you have to add CCUS to this project, which will up the cost many billions of dollars. And another thing that people are not aware of at all is that in the background, there's a group of senators called the climate senators for climate. So there are about 40, 50 senators, and they have a bill, I think it's S243. We have a short video about it on our website, but they plan to cut off all financing for any project that has any relationship to fossil fuels. So, the government may say, oh, yes, we're going to grandfather in these gas plants, or, oh, yes, we would never shut you down entirely. Don't worry about it. No problem. In the background, the senators are actively trying to cut off financing for any fossil fuel operation. And these senators have, of course, all the ENGOs on board, a whole bunch of big investors on board. They've got lots and lots of very powerful supporters. So, we might be fooled into saying, oh, well, I guess it's going to be okay then, only to have this end run by the Senate, which is supposed to be the chamber of sober second thought.
As you say that's exactly what Mark Carney does for the United Nations, former head of the Bank of Canada. That's what he does. He works to debank fossil fuel projects, and it looks like he has been in the ear of these senators who are, I guess, applying a social credit environmental score to these energy projects that are in the national interest. And if we think this can't happen, ask a convoyer what happens when you have the wrong social credit score, according to the government.
Right. And one more thing, we have to remember that Catherine McKenna, who is working with the high-level expert group at the UN, and her report, Integrity Matters, their objective is to have no fossil fuels whatsoever. Not just that you can buy and trade, cap and trade, that you could buy carbon credits to offset your emissions, not just that you reduce it or that you reduce the intensity, nada, nothing. So, this is like hyper craziness at the UN level, but she's also a very influential person. She won she was awarded the Légion d'honneur from France, the Legion of Honor. And why? Because she enacted French national carbon policy internationally, especially in Canada, right? That was the France-Canada Climate Culture Agreement of 2015, I think.
Wow. Now, just shifting gears, but also on the very same topic as we talk about end of life of green energy projects and what to do with these toxic sites when we're done. One thing on the list of things we wanted to talk about was as they move away from fossil fuels, or try to get us to move away from fossil fuels and shift to green energy, you end up with these massive battery farms. And these massive battery farms can be highly toxic and highly dangerous, particularly if a fire breaks out there, because you do need specialized firefighting to happen there. And again, I just want to apply the same standards we give to the oil industry on green energy. So I think all oil and gas installations, they have to have industrially trained firefighters on site. Some of them are private, some of them work directly for the company, but that's, again, not a standard set for green energy.
Yeah, well, there's a fellow, don't remember his name actually, but he's a scientist in the States, and he's been involved in opposing various wind projects and battery projects down there. And he calls them battery electric storage system bombs, because when these things start to light on fire, they go without stopping. And the worst thing is the emissions from them are extremely toxic. Hydrogen fluoride is something that basically can just rot you in a moment. And he calls it using firemen as guinea pigs. So most of these battery electric storage facilities would be outside of major communities, but that means that rural firefighters, most of whom are volunteers and not that well equipped, would be the first responders, and they would definitely be putting their lives seriously at risk. And there's a peer-reviewed paper I think I sent you where they did an experiment in Europe testing out the emissions from these lithium-ion battery fires, and it's pretty frightening. And again, that's not going to happen all the time, but it just has to happen once, and bad things happen. And these facilities are very large, like the TransAlta one at Pincher Creek. I think it's about the size of a soccer pitch. So, when we were talking about the media outrage, I remember that Jason Markusoff had a story in CBC, and he'd interviewed Bino from Pembina Institute, who kind of blithely said, well, they can just add battery storage and, no problem. Well, first of all, it's phenomenally expensive. Secondly, it has to be replaced every 10 years for millions of dollars, because the battery life is short, when you're charging and discharging. And battery storage like that really doesn't cover anything more than a few minutes to a couple of hours. So you say, oh, well, we'll buy a whole bunch of batteries and then we'll cover all the hours. Well, people don't realize that power use varies on like an hourly basis. And Ken Gregory did an analysis for us, for the US actually, and found that it would cost something like $200 trillion US. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I can send it to you, to have a wind solar battery configuration that would power the US, which is more than the US GDP. And that would be similar in Alberta. I think one of our reports indicates it would be about $2 trillion to have sufficient battery backup, because you can't have it just for 2 or 3 days or even a week. You need enough to cover reliably a long period of time, which often can be 30, 40 days. So it's phenomenally expensive. It's dangerous, and it's not something that you can just blithely do overnight.
Yeah, and it will be in rural communities in prime agricultural farmland. Like
That's it.
that's the only place with that kind of room to create these sort of facilities.
Yeah.
Also in the news, I wanted to ask you about this because you did a really great video. Again, telling people to calm down, but also taking the right tone amidst a tragedy. Right now, we see, as is always the case with any sort of wildfire, that the left is using the graves of the people who have died and the people who have suffered loss and tragedy to push their climate change agenda. And again, fires in Hawaii, just like the fires in Alberta, like the fires in BC, like the fires in Quebec, the left is telling us that these are caused by climate change. So tell us what you found when you looked into the issue.
Well, it turns out that the Hawaiian Islands, especially the Lahaina area, have been at serious risk of wildfire for a long time. And our forestry wildfire consultant said actually he's surprised it hadn't happened until now. And one thing that's happened is the islands used to have a lot of sugarcane and pineapple plantations. So these were all irrigated and tended. And over time, that industry has shut down. I think it's gone from about 80% to about 45% land use now or something like that. In its place has grown all of this invasive species of grass, which I've got a video I can send you of a fire in Oahu with the grass is about 3 meters tall, and then it dries. So, people always think that the islands are lush tropical places. They are, but they also have a dry season, and it depends on what side of the island you're on. So if you're on the drier side and you have all these lush grasses standing tall, when they dry, it's just like the best kindling ever. It's tremendous fuel load. And then if you have a fire start there and a wind, whoosh, it'll just run right through it. And you can see pictures on Google Maps where the grass grows right up to these communities. So unfortunately, the grass lights on fire. The ember storm comes, it enters into houses. And the other thing our wildfire consultant said is that most things in homes are combustible, very combustible now. Like they're different materials today. So a lot of these houses, unfortunately, burn from the inside out. And the trees didn't burn so much. People are saying, well, why didn't the trees burn? Because it was essentially a grass fire that just swept through. It wasn't like a slow burn where trees would then actually, after a time, catch on fire and burn down. It kind of went through all the combustibles and kept going. So it's a terrible tragedy, and I'm sure that there will be many more people lost because, it's very hard to escape, and probably a lot of people simply suffocated.
Yeah. I mean, anybody who lives on the prairies knows just how fast a grass fire can move. I mean, it is so fast. It's almost as though you can't get out of the way of it. And that seems to be sort of what happened in Hawaii. And it's just terrible, especially if you're unaccustomed to experiencing that. Grass fires are a thing that happens on the prairies all the time. A spark from a train can cause a grass fire that can burn for days and days. A cigarette butt out the window. If you live in an area that has been a grass fire waiting to happen, but it hasn't happened yet, you really don't know what to do when it does.
Mm-hmm. And you can look at our presentation, which is on YouTube, and I will also post the PowerPoint on our blog. But you can see that for a long time, the wildfire people in Hawaii have been assessing the potential risks and dealing with other wildfires. There have been many other wildfires, but not combined with this kind of wind. So just a tremendous tragedy all around.
It is, but leave it to the environmentalists left to use a tragedy to their own ends. I wanted to ask you about something that is near and dear to my heart, and I think yours as well, and that is the ability to speak our minds on issues that we have carefully researched, to share our feelings, to share our findings, but it doesn't seem like that could be the case if the left gets their way. with some policies that are being led out of the United Nations. So why don't you tell us about what the policies that are proposed could mean for Canada, but also what they could mean for skeptics of official narratives like yourself, and I guess myself too.
People may not be aware that in June, just shortly after the special interlocutor on missing children and unmarked graves, that's Kimberly Murray, just after her interim report came out, I think it was 4 days after, the Justice Department issued an action directive on the United Nations Declaration of Rights for Indigenous Peoples, or commonly known as UNDRIP. UNDRIP was adopted, I think it was in 2021, not too sure. In the directive, they want to align all laws in Canada with UNDRIP. So this could have extremely far-reaching consequences for everything in Canada. Now, as part of the special interlocutor's report, she declared that people like myself who have worked for many years with historical research, I worked with Dr. Hugh Dempsey at the Glenbow Museum for 3 years. He was my research supervisor as I did a number of historical documentaries, and I continued doing historical work for the rest of that decade and often consulted with him and the other people there. So what I'm saying is I come from a point of view of knowledge. The special interlocutor would like to silence people like me, and also the person who's in charge of the archives at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, Raymond Frogner. He would also like to silence me. So Kimberly Murray has sent to the UN, and you need to understand, she is just a civil servant. She's not an elected official of any kind. She was supposed to report to the Justice Minister. She sent the UN special rapporteur on the rights, the human rights of Indigenous people. His name is Jose Francisco Calitze. She sent him a report accusing Canada of genocide. And it's important to note that the day after Canada adopted UNDRIP, China accused Canada of genocide. So I don't see that there's evidence of genocide in Canada in terms of the Indian residential school issue. And I've written quite a few commentaries about it, even though I know that a lot of people will hate me for doing that. But I can't remain silent. And I also think that there's we're basically killing the spirit of our young people by creating this cloud of horror and genocide and not presenting the constructive and positive aspects of our history that I know about and that I put forward. So, these things are all going to converge in September, and people shouldn't take it lightly. Like, if Canada is accused of genocide by Jose Francisco Calitze, and if China has its way, think of the implications for that in terms of us as a member of the World of Nations, a member of the G7, trying to do trade with certain countries. What kind of implications might there be for us? For instance, recall that when South Africa was accused of apartheid, there were huge embargoes. It made life very difficult for them. So, and, I don't see anyone in our political culture saying anything about this. It's like people go, okay. In fact, all of our politicians on October the 27th, I think it was 2022, they all voted to declare Indian residential schools as genocide. All of our politicians did, with no evidence and no discussion. So we basically accused ourselves of genocide. We have a civil servant handing over to a UN official documents that are unvetted and I believe very incorrect, that will put us in a very compromised position trying to argue our case. So,
I think it is. I think it's terrible because Canadian politicians have put us on par with the likes of China and their Uyghur genocide, the Khmer Rouge, the ISIS Caliphate. Like, that's what they're saying we are when they throw these words around. And I think it's terrible. Yes, of course, bad things happened at residential schools. And the UN, by the way, is fully equipped to investigate genocide. They've done it before in other places. So perhaps before they declare us a genocidal state, send in a team and start doing some excavations. Because when they did excavate in Edmonton, they didn't find anything. And so I think that leads me to believe that that is perhaps why they're not excavating in British Columbia.
well, in all the time that I worked in the Glenbow and all the archival material that I went through and all the hundreds of pioneers that I talked to and descendants of people who signed Treaty 7 and descendants of Colonel MacLeod. In all that time, I never saw or heard of any missing persons report about a child attending Indian residential schools. And you would think with 150,000 students over the course of 113 years, if people were enrolling their children in the school, which is what you had to do, and then their child disappeared, you'd think that they would write a report, they would file a complaint, that there would be documentation, that since the child had been entered into the system, that there would be either documents missing about that child that would make you go, aha, or there would be filed reports saying, look, we took our child to this school and they vanished on this date and we haven't seen them since. Open an inquiry. I have never seen any documents like that. So it would be extremely conspiratorial to think that all of these schools and all of these documents and all of these children, that somehow these kinds of things were nefariously hidden throughout this entire system. And in fact, where is that book? I'm just reading this fabulous book called 4 Years and Then Some, which is about this woman from Saskatchewan who went to work up at Klavik. And it's just a wonderful, heartwarming story. Like, the kids at her school loved her, they adored her, and she adored them. So when you read things like that, you go, wait a minute, what's everybody talking about?
And I think if the Liberals truly believed that Canada was a genocidal state for the government's role in the residential schools, someone might call the cops on Jean Chrétien, being the last Indian Affairs minister who signed off on the residential schools. But nobody has. If the left truly believed that residential schools were the result of the actions of a genocidal state and a genocidaire named Jean Chrétien, go get him. He's still alive. But they don't, which leads me to believe how unserious they are about this.
Yeah. The other thing people have to realize is that the potential for genocide judgment against Canada, for the Indigenous people who are part of the Land Back movement, they see this as the lever to literally get all the land back in Canada. Now, there are some people who say, no, we don't mean that. We just mean that, we'll be sharing the land. And it's kind of like, well, that's what we're doing. Because where does the $60 billion in compensation come from, if not from taxpayers who are working on the land of Canada and sharing that money in terms of compensation? So, I think that the outrage that we've seen in downtown Winnipeg, there've been a number of pretty rowdy demonstrations with people chanting "No Pride in Genocide," and the Mohawk Warriors have been there, and many people maybe have forgotten about what happened at Oka. But most people probably remember that there was Shut Down Canada a couple of years ago, where Canada was shut down. All the roads and rail infrastructure were shut down for 2 months by Indigenous activists who were outraged about residential schools. and the alleged genocide. Well, if there's no genocide, then there's no reason to do that. And if our objective is reconciliation, then let's sit down and reconcile. Let's talk.
Before I let you go, Michelle, and again, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I want to give you the opportunity to do two things. You have an event coming up. and I want you to promote people. I've been to your events. They are wonderful. The food's great. It's you'll find a room full of like-minded people, but also not like-minded people, but people who want to engage in civil discourse. So there's no ideological homogeneity happening there. And please let us know how people can support the work that you do at Friends of Science, because I say it every time you're on the show, you are up against the deepest of the deep green pockets, and the government, the foreign-funded environmentalist movement, and you're just this little juggernaut of truth. So please tell us how we can get involved in supporting Friends of Science. It's great.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, you can go to our website, www.friendsofscience.org, and right there you'll see the announcement for our upcoming event. It's going to be on October the 17th this year at the Red and White Club in Calgary. It's a buffet dinner and then our two speakers. The name of the event is Break Free from Climate Tyranny, Evidence over Ideology. Our two speakers will be Robert Lyman, who will be asking the question, when will climate policy hit the wall? Robert was here in 2017, and at that time he asked the question, can Canada survive climate change policy? At the time he thought we could. Now he's not so sure. Our second speaker will be more on the science and energy issues. That will be Dr. Ian Clark, Professor Emeritus from the University of Ottawa. And he'll be talking on climate and net zero, a reality check. So it's really a great evening. We have the buffet dinner, people mingle, there's a cash bar, we have some tables with bling. Then we have our first speaker, then we have a break, cash bar, bling, mingle, desserts, coffee,
it's worth every penny.
And then our second speaker, and then we have
Michelle,
Q&A
thanks
at
so much
the end.
for coming on the show,
So,
and we'll talk very, very soon,
as you said, probably half the people who come are our members, and about half the people who have come the past few years are not members, not interested in climate change per se, but they realize that all these policies are really infringing on their...
This free episode of The Gun Show is brought to you by my mug. I know, it's pretty cool. So is this hoodie I got on, and you could have it on too if you check out our special website at rebelnewsstore.com. That's where you can see Freedom Focus hoodies that we have for you, beanies, cell phone cases, you name it, all while supporting our journalism, where we fight to bring you the other side of the story, as opposed to, being forced by the Trudeau government to fund leftist media out of your taxes. The truth is, without you and your generosity, there is no Rebel News. So again, if you like the reports that we bring you and that we also fight for freedoms in Canada, please consider doing some shopping, picking up some swag at rebelnewsstore.com. We appreciate your support.
Well, we've come to the portion of the show where I invite your viewer feedback, because without viewer feedback, there really is no Rebel News. Because if you don't like what we're doing here, you won't support us. And without your support, we don't exist, because we'll never take a penny from Justin Trudeau or any level of government, because how could we ever hold them to account if we relied on them to keep the lights on? But because I invite your viewer feedback, I have to give you my email address right now. It's sheila@rebelnews.com. Put gun show letters in the subject line so I know you're talking about the show. And it's also becomes easier for me to find. But don't hesitate to leave a comment wherever you might be watching us. For example, if you're watching the free version of the show, thank you for sitting through the ads. You can find that on Rumble or YouTube sort of towards the weekend. So leave me a comment there. Sometimes I go poking over there. But today, the letter comes from the email, and it comes from Eric in Saskatoon. It says his wife and he are huge fans and longtime supporters. Well, that's great. Let's keep going. I have a suggestion for you, Re the Gun Show. Have you reached out to Tom McDonald to invite him to come on as a guest? Yes, actually, I have. And we had a connection to Tom McDonald through someone who used to work for us here at Rebel News, Matt Brevner, also a musician, Canadian musician, who we were lucky enough to have working for us as a very talented videographer. But he was a Juno Award nominated musician and someone in the freedom music space. So he had a connection with Tom McDonald. However, Tom McDonald did not come on my show, obviously. But you fill me in about who Tom McDonald is, and I already know, but maybe the viewers don't, so let's keep reading. In addition to his amazing music, which I'm sure you've heard about, including his latest masterpiece, Your America, I think there are so many things you guys could talk about to make it an amazing episode. He's from your neck of the woods, born and raised in St. Albert and Edmonton. That is true. He has experience working in the oil sands. Also true. And I know a little thing or two about the oil and gas industry. And he was a pro wrestler. And yes, I do very much enjoy pro wrestling. I know he's pretty selective with which media outlets he does interviews with. He's a natural skeptic. Who can blame him? I do know that he has been on Ben Shapiro's Daily Wire, Newsmax, and OAN. With Rebel being the largest independent news organization in Canada, his home, I think your reach might appeal to him. Thanks for considering. Keep up the great work. Sincerely, Eric, aka the first guy wearing the Menzoid t-shirt. Oh, I know exactly who you are. And I met you in Regina at an event we held there after Patrick Moore was canceled from his speaking talk there. We re-platformed Patrick Moore so that his voice could be heard. And we did it in the grandest of fashion. Yes, I have reached out to Tom McDonald in the past. But as you say, he's a skeptic, doesn't do a lot of interviews. And so he just politely declined. No hard feelings or anything. I understand why he doesn't do media interviews. He really doesn't have to, right? Like he's like Trump. He just goes directly to the people with his YouTube channel and his other platforms, and he just speaks to the people directly. He doesn't need to speak to them through me. Totally get it, and good for him. So I hope that answers your question. I have reached out to Tom. I'm a fan of Tom. We would have a lot to talk about given my particular interests and background, but he's just doing his own thing, and I admire that. Well, friends, that's the show for tonight. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you to my producers behind the scenes who put the show together so that it's there for you to watch whenever you're ready to watch it. And thanks to all the team in Toronto and around the world to make sure the show is published for you to watch it, because that's the thing we have to do around here. I'll see everybody back here in the same time, in the same space next week. And as I always say every single week, don't let the government tell you that you've had too much to think.